AITA for refusing to babysit my husband's kids so he can have some time off. I am child-free. He promised wouldn't ask me to babysit, but now he's asking because he and their mother are busy. I honestly never thought I would be writing something like this, but here I am. I, 29F, am married to my husband Dan, 34M. Dan has 3 kids from a previous marriage, an 11-year-old son, a 7-year-old son, and a 6-year-old son. Let me just start by saying that I knew Dan had kids when we started dating, and I was totally fine with it. I like kids in general. I just have never wanted any of my own. And before we even got serious, Dan made it very clear that he was not looking for a mom for his children. He told me point blank that his kids already had 2 parents, and he was not searching for someone to step into that role. He was looking for a wife for himself. I really appreciated that honesty. When we first started dating, he only had the kids on the weekends, and honestly, back then, everything was fine. I would see them around sometimes, they were usually polite enough, and Dan handled everything related to them. He never once asked me to babysit or to get involved beyond just being around. I told him very early on that while I liked kids, I had no interest in raising or babysitting anyone else's children. He completely understood and even said that if he ever needed a babysitter, he would just hire his niece or someone else. It felt like we were on the same page. Fast forward 4 years, and things have changed. About a year ago, Dan and his ex-wife moved from the weekend custody schedule to a full 50-50 split. The kids were getting older, and they decided it made more sense for them to spend equal time with both parents. So now it is 1 full week with Dan, 1 full week with their mom, back and forth. It was always part of the plan, but it definitely changed the rhythm of our lives. I adjusted because, again, I knew this was part of being with someone who had kids. I still kept my boundaries, though. I help when I want to help. I am happy to cook for them sometimes. I go to their soccer games and school events occasionally because I genuinely like being supportive. I will take them out for ice cream if I feel like it. But I have kept it clear in my mind, and, I thought, in Dan's, that I am not a third parent. I am their dad's wife who they like hanging out with. Another thing that happened recently is that Dan lost his previous job. It was a really good job, paid well, and gave him a lot of flexibility. Unfortunately, after some restructuring, he got laid off. It took a while, but he eventually found another job. It pays decently but definitely not as much as the previous one. At the same time, his niece, the one who used to babysit occasionally, graduated high school and went off to college out of state. So now, when Dan needs a babysitter, he cannot just call her up anymore. To make matters worse, babysitters in our area are really expensive, and because his kids are a handful, and honestly, they are a handful, they are used to getting their way because their parents never really agreed on discipline strategies, no one wants to deal with them for cheap. So, this brings us to the issue. Dan had committed months ago to being a groomsman in one of his best friend's weddings. This past weekend was the bachelor party. Apparently, it was a whole big thing, weekend trip, activities, parties, the whole shebang. I had known about the bachelor party in a vague way, but I did not really pay attention to the details because, frankly, it had nothing to do with me. Late Thursday night, literally 2 days before the weekend was supposed to start, Dan approached me while I was reading in bed and casually asked if I could watch the kids all weekend so he could attend the bachelor party. He said it like it was no big deal, like I would just agree without a second thought. I was honestly stunned for a second. I asked him if he was serious. He said yes, and that he really needed this weekend to blow off steam and relax with his friends, and that it would mean a lot if I could just help out. I told him that I already had plans. I had a gym session scheduled on Saturday morning and brunch with my mother afterward. Plus, I was planning on doing a little shopping and just enjoying a quiet weekend to myself. It was going to be one of the few weekends where I actually got some peace because it was not our week with the kids. Why would I want to cancel my plans to stay home all weekend wrangling 3 wild children? Especially when it was not an emergency. It was a bachelor party, not a funeral or someone being rushed to the hospital. Dan immediately got upset. He started guilt-tripping me, saying that he thought by now I would have changed my mind about being more involved, that he had assumed after all this time that I would be willing to step in when he needed me. I reminded him, very firmly, that before we got married, he promised he would never expect me to be a babysitter for his kids. That was part of our original agreement. I had been completely transparent from the start about my boundaries, and I had not moved the goalposts once. If anything, I had done way more than I ever said I would. Cooking for them, going to games, showing up to support them, none of that was part of the original deal, but I did it because I wanted to, not because I was obligated. I told him that if it were an emergency, if there were literally no other options and something critical happened, of course I would step in. I care about the kids. I want them to be safe and happy. But a bachelor party does not qualify as an emergency. It is not my problem that he cannot afford a babysitter anymore. It is not my fault that he waited until the last possible second to try and sort it out. I am not responsible for covering for him when he wants to ditch his parenting duties for a weekend of drinking and partying. He was pretty pissed. He ended up staying home with the kids while I went about my weekend as planned. He barely spoke to me for a couple of days afterward. But honestly, I feel like he needed the reality check. Being a parent means sometimes you have to miss things you really want to do. It sucks, but that is the deal you make when you bring kids into the world. It is not fair for him to expect me to pick up the slack just because it is inconvenient for him now. I did not sign up to be a part-time nanny or a backup parent. I really do love Dan. And I really do like his kids. But I feel like he is completely in the wrong here. He is trying to blur the boundaries that he himself helped set at the beginning of our relationship. And that makes me feel like he either did not take me seriously back then or he thinks he can just change the terms now that we are married. I am not okay with that. Anyway, now I am wondering if I was too harsh. Maybe I could have been more flexible. Maybe I should have just watched them to keep the peace. But at the same time, I feel like if I do that once, it opens the door for him to start expecting it again and again. So, am I the asshole here? Update 1. After our argument, I told Dan flat out that if he still wanted to go to the bachelor party so badly, he needed to figure something else out because I was not canceling my plans to babysit. I had made commitments for my weekend that I was looking forward to, and I was not going to be the one to sacrifice my time because he failed to plan ahead. I suggested that he try calling his niece, Rachel, the one who used to babysit for him before she went off to college. I knew she had moved a few hours away for school, but if he was willing to pay her properly for her time and travel, there was a chance she might agree. Dan did not seem thrilled with the idea, but it was clear he had no better options. That night, he pulled out his phone and called Rachel while I sat on the couch pretending to scroll through my phone. In reality, I was shamelessly eavesdropping because I was curious to see how he was going to handle this. I could hear his voice from across the room, starting out casual and light, trying to play it off like it would be such a huge favor if she could just come down for a couple of days. At first, Rachel sounded polite but hesitant. I could tell she was trying to let him down easy. She mentioned that she was swamped with classes and had a work-study job she could not easily miss. Dan, desperate, started sweetening the pot, offering to pay her whatever she thought was fair. He sounded almost frantic, trying to sell the idea to her like it would not be that big of a deal and she could just fit it into her schedule somehow. There was a long pause, and then Rachel said, in a very firm tone that carried across the living room even though I could only hear his side of the conversation, that she could come but it would cost him $300 a day, non-negotiable. I watched Dan's entire face shift in real time. It was like someone had reached through the phone and slapped him. $300 a day for 2.5 days was almost $1,000, not including whatever other expenses she might have had. He tried to protest a little, but Rachel was done negotiating. He mumbled a few more things into the phone, then hung up looking completely defeated. When he finally turned to me and explained the situation, it was almost laughable how shocked he was. He kept muttering about how ridiculous it was, how Rachel used to babysit for $20 an hour, how she used to be grateful for the extra cash. I just looked at him and shrugged. The situation had changed. Rachel was no longer a teenager living at home with nothing but free time and a learner's permit. She was a full-time college student with actual responsibilities now. If he wanted her to drop everything and spend a whole weekend wrangling 3 hyperactive boys who fought over everything from video games to who got the last granola bar, he was going to have to pay a premium. Of course, after that option blew up in his face, Dan immediately circled back to me. He started in with the same tired lines about how we were family, how family is supposed to help each other out in times of need. He threw around words like loyalty and commitment like they were supposed to magically change the situation. He even tried to guilt-trip me by saying that if the roles were reversed, he would help me without hesitation. I stayed calm. I told him that while we were indeed family, I was not his built-in free childcare service. I reminded him, once again, that I never agreed to be a default babysitter when we got married. I reminded him that I had made my feelings about raising children crystal clear long before we ever tied the knot. I was kind enough to help with the kids when I chose to, cooking for them, going to their games, taking them out sometimes, but that did not mean he could start treating me like a live-in nanny whenever it suited him. Most importantly, I was not the boys' mother. Their actual mother was still very much alive and capable, and if he truly needed a weekend off, he should be coordinating with her instead of turning to me. There was a heavy silence after I said that. Dan sat there for a while, looking like he wanted to argue but realizing he really did not have a leg to stand on. He had made promises to me at the start of our relationship. He had set expectations. He could not just move the goalposts now because life had gotten harder for him. That was not how fairness worked. That was not how respect worked. I could tell he was bitter about the whole thing. He did not try to argue anymore that night. He did not bring up the bachelor party again. Instead, he grumbled something about needing to reschedule with his friends and went off to call them. I spent the rest of the evening relaxing exactly as I had planned, feeling a little sad that it had come to this but also feeling firm in my decision. Saturday morning, I went to my gym session as planned. I felt a little guilty leaving the house knowing Dan was in a mood, but not guilty enough to cancel my own plans. Afterward, I had brunch with my mom, who could immediately tell something was on my mind. I ended up telling her the whole story over pancakes and coffee, and she immediately backed me up. She said that standing my ground was the right thing to do, that I had been upfront and honest from the beginning and had every right to enforce the boundaries I had set. She also reminded me that it was not a betrayal of family to protect my own mental health and my own time. When I got home later that afternoon, Dan was still distant. He had taken the kids out to a local park to blow off some steam, and the house was a little chaotic but not a disaster. We barely spoke for the rest of the weekend. It was uncomfortable, but I was not going to be the one to break first. I had done nothing wrong. I had simply enforced the expectations we had mutually agreed on before we ever stood at the altar. By Monday, things started to thaw a little. Dan was clearly still nursing his bruised ego, but he had no choice but to move on. Life with 3 kids does not leave a lot of time to sulk indefinitely. He handled the kids on his own, just like he was supposed to. No emergency babysitters. No $1,000 bribes. No abandoning responsibility. Part of me wonders if he will bring this up again someday. Part of me thinks this might have been a needed wake-up call for him, a reminder that no matter how comfortable a relationship feels, you cannot just rewrite the agreements you made without the other person's consent. For now, though, the house is peaceful again. We are back to normal, or at least as normal as things get around here, and Dan has not brought up the bachelor party, or babysitting, or anything else related to it since. He did not say much after that. Update 2. The next morning, after thinking about how absurd the whole situation had gotten, I decided that enough was enough. I was tired of being dragged into this endless cycle of guilt and last-minute scrambling when none of this was supposed to be my responsibility to begin with. If Dan would not step up and call his ex-wife, then I would. I figured it was time someone actually tried to handle this like an adult instead of just hoping I would roll over and sacrifice my weekend out of convenience. I scrolled through our awkward family group chat where we exchanged things like holiday schedules, school updates, and reminders for the boys' sports games, and found his ex-wife's number easily. I stared at it for a minute, wondering if I should even get involved, but then I thought about the fact that no one seemed to think twice about getting me involved when it was convenient for them. So I typed out a polite but very direct message. I explained that Dan had something come up unexpectedly and that we needed help covering the boys for the weekend. I kept it respectful, almost painfully so, because the last thing I wanted was to open the door to unnecessary drama. I did not even have time to set my phone down before the typing dots popped up. Within 10 minutes, she responded with a casual, "I'm sorry, but I have my own plans this weekend. It's not my week with the kids. Best of luck." I literally just stared at my phone, feeling this slow, cold disbelief spread through me. Not her week with the kids. The exact same excuse Dan had been throwing at me like it was some sort of magic get-out-of-jail-free card. It hit me then, harder than ever before, how twisted the situation had become. The 2 people who actually created these kids, the 2 people who were supposed to be responsible for their well-being, were both acting like their obligations could be paused the second it was inconvenient for them. And yet somehow, I, the one who had very clearly opted out of parenthood, was expected to set everything aside and step up because I was geographically close and emotionally easier to guilt trip. I felt this low, simmering rage building under the surface. Not the hot, shouting kind of anger, but the colder kind that makes everything feel sharper, more crystal clear. I stayed calm, though. I was done arguing, done justifying, done explaining things that should have been obvious to any adult with a shred of responsibility. I took a screenshot of her text and quietly saved it in case it came up later. Then I tucked my phone away and went on with my day. When Dan got home from work that night, it was like he had decided to just pretend the earlier conversations had not happened. He was light, almost overly cheerful during dinner, asking about my day, chatting with the kids, acting like the tension hanging in the air did not exist. I played along, because honestly, what else was I going to do? But I could feel it coming, like a pressure building behind a dam. Sure enough, after the boys went to bed and the house had quieted down, he brought it up again. He leaned across the couch with this look in his eyes, part pleading, part desperate, and said that he really needed this weekend, that there was literally no one else who could help. He sounded exhausted, worn down, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered all the choices that had led us here, his lack of planning, his refusal to set realistic expectations, his assumption that I would just fall in line because it was easier than making hard calls. Inside, I was furious. Not just because of the situation itself, but because of how little respect I felt like I was being shown. I had been crystal clear about my role in the beginning. I had given more than I promised, stepped up more than I ever said I would, and still it was not enough. Still, when the chips were down, it was expected that I would be the one to bend. But the reality was that Dan was not wrong. There really was no one else. I could see it clearly, the babysitters were too expensive, his niece had priced herself out, his ex-wife refused to lift a finger unless it was legally required, and every friend and neighbor had long since learned how chaotic the boys could be and steered clear of volunteering. Still, just because I was the only option did not mean I was going to be guilt-tripped into it for free. If Dan wanted me to act as the emergency babysitter, then it was going to come with emergency babysitter conditions. If he needed me to be a babysitter for his kids, then it was going to come with babysitter conditions. Update 3. So after sitting there on the couch, feeling the full weight of how ridiculous the entire situation had become, I decided it was time to have a very serious conversation with Dan, but on my terms. I called him over and told him, very sweetly, almost too sweetly, that I had thought about it and that I was willing to cancel my gym session, skip my brunch with my mom, and give up my rare peaceful weekend. I told him I would stay home and watch the boys, but only under one very clear and non-negotiable condition: he had to buy me the brand new iPhone I had been eyeing for months. Not a used model. Not last year's clearance version. I meant the full-priced, latest generation, top-of-the-line iPhone, with all the bells and whistles, the biggest storage option, and the color I wanted. Dan's reaction was honestly priceless. He looked like I had physically slapped him. His mouth fell open, and he just stared at me, completely thrown off balance. For a good 10 seconds, he just gawked at me like he was trying to process whether I was joking or had lost my mind. When he finally found his voice, he sputtered something about whether I was actually serious. I smiled at him, all calm and composed, and said yes, I was absolutely serious. I explained that he was asking me to give up my weekend, my plans, my personal time, and my peace of mind to corral 3 high-energy boys who had a talent for turning the house into a disaster zone within hours. I told him that favors of that magnitude did not come for free. If he wanted me to put in the work of a professional babysitter, and honestly, it was more like wrangling a pack of tiny wild animals, then he needed to pay for it, just like he would pay anyone else. Only in this case, the payment was going to be something that actually made it worth my while. He started pacing around the living room, muttering to himself, trying to figure a way out of it. He ran through all the usual arguments, all the little guilt trips, but none of it was landing anymore. I had made my decision. There was no room for negotiation. He either wanted his weekend of freedom badly enough to buy me the phone, or he could cancel his plans and stay home like a responsible parent. Simple as that. After what felt like an eternity of internal struggle on his part, Dan begrudgingly agreed. I could see how much it physically pained him to say yes, but his desperation to go to the bachelor party won out over his hatred of spending that much money in one sitting. I nodded, accepted his agreement, and immediately told him to text his friends that he was back on for the weekend. And so, that weekend, I stayed home with the boys. It was exactly as chaotic as I had expected. Within the first 3 hours, they had managed to turn the living room into what looked like the aftermath of a minor natural disaster. There were snack wrappers everywhere, half a bag of chips crushed into the carpet, and a suspicious sticky spot in the kitchen that nobody would admit to creating. They fought over video games, they argued about whose turn it was to feed the dog, they managed to knock over a lamp while roughhousing even though I told them 1,000 times to calm down. At one point, I actually had to break up a wrestling match over a plastic dinosaur toy. By Saturday afternoon, I was exhausted. I did not even try to cook anything elaborate, it was frozen pizza and juice boxes all the way. I counted down the hours, the minutes, the literal seconds until Dan would walk through that door and take over. I kept my sanity by reminding myself, over and over again, that there was a shiny new iPhone waiting for me at the end of this ordeal. When Dan finally returned on Sunday evening, sunburned from too much time outside and looking way too pleased with himself, I did not say a word. I did not ask how his weekend was. I did not ask if he had fun. I simply walked up to him, held out my hand expectantly, and waited. The unspoken message was loud and clear: you got your weekend, now it is time for me to get what you owe. True to his word, Dan took me to the Apple store the next day. He shuffled behind me like a man headed for execution while I happily browsed through the gleaming displays, testing out colors and storage options. I picked out the exact phone I wanted, the biggest, nicest, newest model, loaded up with all the features. I watched with silent satisfaction as he pulled out his credit card and paid for it, wincing like every swipe of the card physically hurt him. I did not feel the slightest bit guilty. Walking out of that store, new phone in hand, I felt lighter than I had in days. I felt like I had finally drawn a line in the sand and stood by it. Actions have consequences. Promises matter. Boundaries mean something, even when it is uncomfortable. Especially when it is uncomfortable. Dan learned something important that weekend, or at least I hope he did. He learned that if he wanted to offload responsibility onto me, if he wanted to treat me like a babysitter instead of a wife with her own life and plans, then it was going to cost him. It was not going to be a freebie. It was not going to be something he could guilt trip or wheedle or whine his way into. If he needed me to be a babysitter for his kids, then it was going to come with babysitter conditions.